Clearwater Basin, Montana Territory. The 7th of November, 1889. The autumn had been a liar, painting the ridge lines in gold and crimson so beautiful they made you forget what always followed, as if the land itself were dressing for a funeral it had no intention of announcing. For Maren Dahl, the beauty carried something worse than forgetting. It carried the smell of fresh-turned earth over a pine box, and the sound of a bank agent's boots on her porch. Her husband Eric had been dead 19 days. Not from the mines, not from a bullet, not from any of the dramatic deaths the territory seemed to specialize in. A fever, a common, ordinary fever that had started as a cough on a Tuesday and ended as a burial on a Thursday, leaving Maren with a shelf of hand-bound journals, a set of grafting tools she barely understood, and a one-room cabin on 40 acres of forest that the Territorial Savings Bank of Helena had already decided was no longer hers. The loan agent, a man named Virgil Croft, arrived on the morning of November 5th with 2 documents and a deputy. Croft was not a villain. He was a man of 43, with wire spectacles and a habit of pulling at his left earlobe when delivering bad news, which he did often enough that the lobe had stretched noticeably longer than the right. He stood on her porch and pulled at it now, his eyes traveling over the blackened tree stumps that dotted the south-facing slope. A wildfire had come through the previous summer, before Eric's death, scorching 60 acres of mixed pine and larch into a graveyard of charcoal spires. "Mrs. Dahl," Croft said, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The bank has reviewed the account." Mr. Dahl was 3 payments behind before his passing. The collateral was the standing timber, and as you can see, he gestured at the burned hillside, at the skeletal trunks standing like blackened fingers against the pale sky. "There is no standing timber. The loan is called. You have until Friday to vacate." 2 days. She had 2 days. "There is a women's boarding house in Missoula," Croft added, folding the documents with precise, practiced creases. "Mrs. Calloway runs a clean establishment. I could write you a letter of introduction." He paused, and something flickered across his face, something that was not quite guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood. He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. "This is not from the bank," he said quietly. "It is from me. $12. For the stage fare." He set it on the porch railing without looking at her and turned to leave. Maren did not touch the envelope. She watched Croft and the deputy walk back down the rutted track toward town, their figures growing smaller against the vast, indifferent landscape. The wind shifted, and she caught the scent that had defined her world for months now, wet charcoal and the ghost of pine pitch, the smell of everything that had burned. She was an outsider twice over in the town of Garnet, a widow now, which made her a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. And before that, a Dane, a woman who spoke English with a melody that turned vowels into something the locals found either charming or suspicious, depending on their mood. Eric had been the bridge, the one who translated her strangeness into something the community could accept. A Danish forester married to a Danish woman was eccentric. A Danish widow alone was inconvenient. The town's sympathy arrived in small, precise doses. Mrs. Duchenbout, Mrs. Gunderson from the general store, sent her eldest boy with a jar of canned peaches and a note that said, "Prayers." The note did not say, "Come stay with us." Tom Adler, who ran the sawmill, tipped his hat when he passed her on the road, but did not slow his horse. Pity, Maren learned, was a bird that landed briefly and flew away the moment you reached for it. Self-preservation was the cage that kept it. What none of them understood, what none of them could see from behind their windows and their conventional certainties, was that Maren carried something more valuable than sympathy. She carried Eric's knowledge, and Eric's knowledge was strange. He had not been a logger. That distinction mattered. The men of Garnet were loggers. They felled trees, bucked them into lengths, milled them into boards. They understood wood as a commodity, a dead thing measured in board feet. Eric had been a forester, trained in the old Danish tradition at the Fredskov school before emigrating. He understood wood as a living system, a network of relationships between soil and water and fungus and light that most people never bothered to notice. She remembered him kneeling beside a burned stump 2 weeks after the fire, pressing his palm flat against the blackened earth while she stood behind him, furious at the destruction, at the loss. He had looked up at her with that expression he wore when the world was showing him something invisible to everyone else. His fingers were black with soot, and he rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger like a man testing flour. "The surface is a fool, Maren," he had said. "Feel here, 3 inches down, but past." She had knelt and pressed her hand into the earth beside the stump. The top was ash and char, dead and powdery. But beneath, just inches beneath, the soil was warm. Not hot. Warm, moist, and damp, and alive with the lace-fine threads of white mycelia, fungal networks that had survived the fire by retreating downward. "The fire thinks it has won," Eric told her, wiping his hands on his trousers. "But the forest is already rebuilding from below. The roots are alive. The mycelium is alive. In a year, this hillside will be doing something no one in this town expects." He had been right, but he had not lived to see it. On the morning of November 7th, with 1 day remaining before Croft's deadline, Maren did not pack. She did not walk to the stage office. She walked up the burned hillside with Eric's journal tucked inside her coat and a spade over her shoulder. The first thing she noticed was the foxes. 3 of them, a vixen and 2 half-grown kits, rust-colored and bright-eyed, threading between the blackened stumps as if they owned the place. They did not run from her. They watched her with that peculiar vulpine alertness, heads tilted, ears swiveling, then went back to what they had been doing, digging. Their narrow snouts were pushed into the earth at the base of a massive burned larch, and they were excavating with frantic, purposeful energy, sending up little fountains of dark soil. Maren stopped. She watched them dig. She watched where they dug. The foxes had found something the rest of the world had written off. Beneath the burned larch, where the root system had been enormous, the fire had hollowed out a cavity. The great taproot and its major laterals had burned slowly underground, the way a coal seam smolders, leaving behind a network of tunnels and chambers in the earth itself, lined with charcoal andite with dry, thermally stable soil. The foxes were using these root cavities as dens. The earth around the old root channels was warmer than the surrounding ground, heated by the slow decomposition of remaining organic matter and insulated by the charcoal lining that the fire had inadvertently created. She opened Eric's journal to a page she had read so many times the binding cracked naturally to it. His handwriting, small and precise with the crossed southerns of a European education. "Charcoal is the skeleton of wood. It does not rot. It does not conduct cold." The Romans knew this. They lined their grain stores with it. A chamber of charcoal is a chamber that remembers warmth and forgets cold. Maren knelt at the base of the burned larch and began to dig. The root cavity was larger than she expected. The main taproot had been nearly 3 feet in diameter, and it had burned out to a depth of 8 feet or more, leaving a shaft that angled down and then opened into an irregular chamber where the major lateral roots had branched. The walls were solid charcoal, black and glittering, dry as bone. When she pressed her bare hand against them, they were not cold. They were neutral, the ambient temperature of the deep earth, somewhere around 50 degrees even as the November air above dropped toward freezing. She spent the first day simply exploring, clearing loose debris from the cavity with her hands and the spade, mapping its shape. It was not a room, it was a root system, and it branched and forked like a maze, but the central chamber where the taproot met the laterals was large enough for a person to sit upright, perhaps 6 feet across and 5 feet high, with 3 smaller passages radiating outward. On the second day, Croft's deadline day, she began the real work. She hauled out loose charcoal and soil, bucket by bucket, using a canvas sack and sheer stubbornness. She widened the entrance shaft so she could pass through it without scraping her shoulders. She flattened the floor of the central chamber and lined it with flat creek stones, laying them in a tight mosaic the way Eric had described Danish farmhouse floors, so they would absorb heat and radiate it slowly through the night. She was not building a shelter. She was cultivating one. The distinction was everything. The charcoal walls were the key. Eric had written extensively about charcoal's thermal properties, its capacity to insulate while also absorbing and slowly releasing heat. A traditional cabin lost its warmth through its walls, fighting a constant battle against the cold outside. But a chamber of charcoal buried in the earth did not fight. It simply held. The temperature underground was stable, and the charcoal lining prevented whatever warmth she generated from escaping into the surrounding soil. By the end of the first week, she had shaped the central chamber into something livable. She had cut pine boughs from the few surviving trees in the canyon bottom and laid them over the stone floor as bedding. She had constructed a small fire pit at the base of the entrance shaft, positioned so that the natural draft, cool air flowing down from one of the lateral root tunnels and warm air rising up the main shaft would ventilate the smoke without suffocating her. The system was not her invention. It was the Earth's invention. She had simply recognized it. The foxes stayed. They occupied one of the lateral tunnels, coming and going through their own entrance 30 feet from hers. She heard them at night, their soft yipping and the scratch of their claws on charcoal. She left scraps from her meals at the junction where her chamber met their tunnel, and in the mornings the scraps were gone, replaced sometimes by a dead vole or a frozen juniper berry, gifts from neighbors who understood the economy of survival better than any banker. She retrieved her iron stove and chest from the old cabin site on the third day. The stove was too large for the root chamber, but she did not need it for the chamber. She needed it for something else. She set it up at the surface near the entrance and used it to heat stones. River cobbles, each the size of a man's fist, heated in the stove until they were almost too hot to handle, then carried down into the chamber in a canvas sling and placed against the charcoal walls. The stones released their heat slowly over hours, and the charcoal walls held it, and the earth around the charcoal held it further, and the temperature in the chamber stabilized at a level that was not comfortable by any civilized standard, but was 60 degrees warmer than the killing air above. November deepened. The work continued. She sealed the gaps around the entrance with a mixture of clay and ash that she tempered with dried grass, creating a door that could be opened for ventilation and closed against the wind. She dug a narrow trench from the chamber to a point 20 feet away and lined it with bark, creating a drainage channel so that snowmelt would not flood her home. She stacked firewood in one of the unused lateral tunnels, where it stayed dry and was shielded from the weather. The townspeople of Garnet did not notice any of this immediately. They were occupied with their own preparations, the splitting of cordwood, the banking of earth against cabin foundations, the salting of meat. But word traveled, the way it does in small places. It was Tom Adler who said it first, standing at the bar of the Garnet Hotel on the last night of November, a whiskey in his thick fist. "The Dahl woman is too up on that burn, living in the ground like a badger, digging holes and keeping foxes. She has lost her mind entirely." The laughter that followed was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of men who needed to believe that their way was the right way, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Silas Croft, who happened to be in Garnet on bank business and overheard this from a corner table, felt a sensation he could not name. He pulled at his earlobe and said nothing. Eloise Gunderson, the shopkeeper's wife, was more direct. She cornered Madden at the general store during a supply run, her face arranged in an expression of Christian concern that did not quite hide the morbid curiosity beneath it. "Mrs. Dahl, you cannot mean to winter in a hole in the ground. It is not how people live. What if the walls collapse? What if you freeze? What will the town say if we let you die out there alone?" "What will the town say?" Marin repeated the words without inflection. She picked up her sack of flour and her small packet of salt. "The town will say what the town says, Mrs. Gunderson. The ground does not care about what the town says. Neither do the foxes." She left the store. The bell above the door rang twice, a bright, sharp sound in the cold air. December came not as a visitor, but as an executioner. The first true blizzard struck on December 9th, a howling wall of white that descended from the continental divide with the force of something personal. The temperature dropped to 30 below, then 40. The wind drove snow horizontally through the streets of Garnet, packing it against doors and windows with such force that several panes cracked. Tom Adler's woodpile, which he had boasted would last until March, began to diminish at a rate that made his wife's face go tight and silent. The road to Missoula disappeared under 6 feet of snow, then 8. Garnet was cut off. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, 3 cabins on the north side of town had developed frost on their interior walls. The chinking between the logs, which had seemed so solid in October, was no match for a wind that found every crack, every gap, every place where craftsmanship met the limits of its materials. Families doubled up, then tripled. The Garnet Hotel became a refugee camp for those whose homes could no longer hold the cold at bay. Firewood consumption doubled, and the communal supply was not infinite. 1 mile away and 200 feet up the burned hillside, Maren Dahl sat in her root chamber with a fox kit asleep against her thigh, and a tallow candle casting warm light on the pages of Eric's journal. The blizzard was a distant sound, a muffled roaring that she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. The heated stones she had placed against the walls 3 hours ago were still radiating warmth. The charcoal walls were dry. The air was still. The temperature in the chamber, she estimated from the behavior of the tallow, which remained soft and pliable, was somewhere near 50 degrees. She was not comfortable. Her back ached from the low ceiling. Her hands were cracked and permanently darkened with charcoal dust. The diet of dried meat and hardtack and the occasional frozen turnip was wearing on her, and she had developed a persistent cough that she treated with a tea made from pine needles, bitter and resinous. But she was alive. She was warm, and the blizzard that was slowly dismantling the town of Garnet could not touch her. The storm lasted 11 days. When it finally broke on December 20th, the silence it left behind was enormous, a ringing, crystalline absence of sound that felt like the world holding its breath. Maren emerged from her entrance shaft into a landscape so transformed that she did not recognize it. The burned stumps were buried. The hillside was a smooth, white expanse broken only by the dark vertical lines of the few surviving trees. The snow was nearly level with the top of her entrance. But the foxes had already been out. Their tracks laced the snow around the entrance in a delicate, purposeful script, and it was their tracks that revealed what the snow had hidden all along. The fox paths did not wander randomly. They followed the buried root lines of the burned trees, the underground network of hollow channels that radiated out from the great larch and connected to the root systems of neighboring stumps. The foxes knew what Maren had only suspected. The entire burned hillside was threaded with these passages, a subterranean web of charcoal-lined tunnels that linked root cavity to root cavity across the slope. The snow, by covering everything but the fox tracks, had drawn a map of this hidden architecture on the surface of the world. Maren could see it clearly for the first time. The paths converged and branched, connecting at least a dozen major root cavities into a single underground system. A root network, not just a den. A village. She followed the fox tracks to the nearest connected cavity, 50 feet from her own, and dug down. She found a chamber nearly as large as her own, dry, charcoal-lined, ready. She followed another track and found another. The burned forest, which everyone had dismissed as destroyed, as worthless, was an entire infrastructure of shelter waiting beneath the surface. The same morning Virgil Croft arrived on horseback, leading a mule loaded with blankets, and looking like a man who had not slept in several days. His spectacles were cracked. His lips were split from the cold. He stopped at the edge of the burn and stared at the thin column of smoke rising from what appeared to be bare snow. He dismounted and followed the smoke to Maren's entrance. She was standing outside, spitting kindling on a stump she had cleared. The fox vixen sat 10 feet away, watching them both with amber eyes that held no opinion. Croft pulled at his earlobe. Then he stopped himself, deliberately, as if the habit embarrassed him. He held out the blankets. "The town is in trouble, Mrs. Dow," he said. His voice was stripped of its professional smoothness. It was just a voice now, tired and honest. 7 families have lost their heating. The woodpile will not last another storm. The road is impassable. He paused. "I have no right to ask you anything." Maren looked at him. She saw the cracked spectacles and the split lips, and the way he stood with his shoulders drawn up against a cold that his fine wool coat could no longer defeat. She saw a man who had handed her an eviction notice and $12 and believed he had done his duty. She saw a man who was learning that duty and decency were not always the same thing. "You have every right," she said. "Everyone does. That is what winter teaches." She did not say, "I told you." She did not say, "Where was your right when you nailed that notice to my door?" She said, "Come inside. I will show you what the foxes showed me." She showed him the root chamber. She showed him the charcoal walls and the heated stones and the ventilation system that the earth itself had engineered. She showed him the fox tracks on the snow and explained what they meant, the network of connected cavities, the underground village that the fire had inadvertently created by burning out the root systems of the old forest. Croft stood in her chamber with his cracked spectacles fogging in the warmth and said nothing for a long time. He placed his bare hand on the charcoal wall and held it there. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We spent 2 weeks cutting firewood. We should have spent 2 days digging. Maren brought them down. All of them, the 7 displaced families, then the others as the second storm came, and the third. She and Croft and Tom Adler, who turned out to be a ferociously efficient digger once his pride was no longer in the way, excavated and prepared 6 of the connected root cavities. They lined the floors with stones. They built fire pits and ventilation channels. They heated river cobbles and packed charcoal insulation around the entrances. The burned hillside that the bank had deemed worthless collateral became the thing that kept 43 people alive through the worst winter Montana had seen in a generation. The foxes tolerated their new neighbors, with the weary patience of landlords who had seen tenants come and go. By February, Croft had written a new assessment of the Dahl property. He sent it to Helena with a personal note that was, by banking standards, extraordinary. The loan was restructured, the land was reappraised, not for its timber, which was gone, but for what Croft called its subsurface thermal architecture, a phrase he had invented because no existing term covered what he had experienced. When spring came, and the snow retreated up the hillside like a slow white tide, the burned stumps emerged again, surrounded by something no one in Garnet expected. Green. The root systems, insulated by the charcoal and energized by the warmth the human inhabitants had inadvertently fed into the soil all winter, were pushing up new growth. Shoots of larch and pine emerged from the bases of the burned trunks, pale and determined. The mycelial networks that Eric had written about were doing exactly what he had predicted, rebuilding the forest from below while the surface world assumed it was dead. Maren taught 6 families to cultivate early-season vegetables in the root chambers that spring, using the stable underground temperature as a natural greenhouse. She taught them the charcoal insulation techniques from Eric's journals. She did not teach them as an expert or a savior. She taught them the way Eric had taught her, by kneeling in the dirt and showing them what was already there. Travelers passing through Garnet in later years would remark on the strange settlement on the burned hillside, the smoke rising from the earth, the fox tracks threading between human footpaths, the green growth pushing up through charcoal. They would ask about the woman who had started it, and the townspeople would point up the hill to where Marindal still lived in her original root chamber, its entrance now framed with new-growth larch saplings, a fox-kit perpetually asleep on the warm stones by her door. She kept Eric's journal on a shelf she had carved into the charcoal wall. On the last page he had written on before the fever took him, there was a single line in his small, precise hand. She read it on winter nights when the stones were warm and the foxes were quiet, and the earth held her the way. The earth holds everything, without judgment, without conditions, without memory of what the surface world thinks it knows. The forest does not end where the fire stops, Marin. It begins there. Now I want to talk to you, not about Marin, but about you, because you are reading this in your own November. Maybe not a literal one, maybe your blizzard is financial. Maybe your eviction notice is a diagnosis, a divorce, a job that vanished, a relationship that burned to the ground and left nothing but black stumps as far as you can see. And the world, your world, is looking at the wreckage and telling you it is worthless. No collateral, no standing timber, nothing left to build on. But what if they are wrong? What if the fire did not destroy the thing you need most? What if it created it? What if the very catastrophe that burned your life to the surface left behind a hidden architecture beneath your feet, a network of strength and knowledge and resilience that is invisible to everyone who only looks at the surface? What root system are you standing on right now that you have been told is dead? What forgotten knowledge, passed down from someone who loved you, someone who saw the world differently, is sitting in a journal you have not opened, a memory you have not revisited, a skill you were told was useless? What foxes have already found the path that you have not thought to follow? The people around you will call it madness. They will say you have lost your mind. They will offer you $12 and a letter of introduction to someone else's life. Take the $12 if you need to, but do not take the life. Dig. Follow the fox tracks. Put your hand on the wall and feel what is already there. Your root chamber is waiting. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival, forest ecology, and thermal insulation. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, ecological, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.